The sound of the drill didn't bother Elias Thorne. Elias was 80. He had spent 40 years in the mines and another 20 over a welding torch. He knew the sound of metal screaming. To him, it was just physics. To Julian Sterling, it was the sound of progress. Julian stood in the center of the vault area, his Italian leather shoes protected by plastic covers. He was 32. His suit cost more than Elias's first house. Julian didn't look at Elias. He looked at his tablet. Data, efficiency, growth. "Mr. Thorne," Julian said, his voice raised over the mechanical whine. "We sent the certified letters. 12 of them. Every other client moved their belongings months ago. We are building a Tier 3 server farm here. The era of paper and rusted keys is over." Elias didn't move. He stood with his back straight, a redwood tree in a storm. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a waxed canvas jacket. His eyes, the color of Wyoming slate, watched the drill bit. "The vault was built to last, Julian," Elias said. His voice was low, rasping, like gravel shifting. "You should have asked the man who built it before you started drilling." Julian let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure condescension. "My engineers have the blueprints, Elias. We don't need folklore. We need space. This locker, number 402, is legally considered abandoned property as of 8 a.m. this morning." The drill bit finally pierced the lock. A sharp crack echoed through the concrete chamber. The smell of hot ozone filled the air. The locksmith stepped back. He looked at Elias, then at Julian. He looked uncomfortable. Men like Elias Thorne usually didn't have much, but what they had, they earned. "Open it," Julian commanded. Elias didn't protest. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply pulled a small black notebook from his pocket and a pencil stub. He noted the time. 08:14 a.m. "Silence," Elias whispered to himself. "The wind is coming." The winter of '68 didn't just break records. It broke men. In Casper, the temperature hit 30 below and stayed there for 19 days. The kind of cold that turns diesel into jelly and makes tool steel as brittle as glass. In the center of town, the Apex National Bank was rising. It was meant to be a 6-story monument to the Wyoming oil boom. Concrete, glass, pride. But there was a secret buried in the blueprints. The surveyors had lied. They'd found a pocket of unstable silt 40 feet down. The building was beginning to tilt, less than an inch, but enough to make the vault doors jam and the glass panes shatter in their frames. The lead architect was a man named Marcus Sterling, Julian's grandfather. He was a man of prestige and he was terrified. If the tilt became public, the bank was dead. The investment was lost. He called the only man who knew how to speak to the bedrock. Elias Thorne. Silas arrived in a truck that had no heater, carrying a welding rig that looked like it had survived the war. He didn't ask about the prestige. He didn't ask about the Sterling name. He walked down into the muddy, frozen pit of the foundation, touched the shivering steel pilings, and spat into the dirt. "You built it on a lie, Sterling," Silas said. His voice was a low growl, barely audible over the wind. "The Earth wants this building, and the Earth usually gets what it wants." For 22 days, Elias Thorne lived in that hole. He engineered a spider web of high-tensile steel anchors, welding them directly to the granite shelf beneath the silt. He was working in a crawl space so tight he had to exhale just to move. The sparks from his torch were the only heat he had. He didn't just weld. He anchored the soul of the building. When the job was done, the bank stood level. It was rock solid. But Marcus Sterling had a problem. The emergency repairs had drained the construction budget. He couldn't pay Silas the $14,200 he'd promised. In 1968, that was enough to buy 2 ranches. They met in a trailer on the construction site. Marcus Sterling offered excuses. He offered future considerations. Elias Thorne leaned across the table. His face was scarred by flash burns. His hands were cracked and stained with iron dust. He didn't want a consideration. "I saved your legacy, Marcus," Silas said. "Now you're going to give me mine." Silas pulled out a contract he had drafted himself. It was granular. It was specific. It was a structural leasehold. He traded his $14,200 fee for a permanent, irrevocable lease on safety deposit locker 402. But the fine print, the part Marcus Sterling was too desperate to read closely, stated that locker 402 was legally defined as the primary inspection access for structural anchors 1 through 14. By owning the lease on that locker, Elias Thorne wasn't just a customer. He was effectively the landlord of the very steel that kept the building from falling into the river. As long as the Thorne family paid the annual fee, the bank could not touch, modify, or obstruct those anchors without Thorne's written consent. Silas knew the bank would grow. He knew they would eventually want to expand, to dig deeper, to install new technology. He knew that one day, greed would forget the man who saved the foundation. "Elias," Silas said to his son years later as they sat on the porch of the farmhouse, "the world is full of men who build on sand. They wear suits and they talk about the future. But the ground stays the same. You keep that key. You pay that 55. Every year, no matter what." Elias had watched his father's hands shake in his final years, the price of 22 days in a frozen pit. So Elias waited. He paid the fee in 1971, when the oil boom peaked. He paid it in 1985, when the bank changed its name for the first time. He paid it in 1999, when they installed the first digital security system. And he paid it last year when Julian Sterling arrived from Chicago with his MBA and his plan to gut the basement. 56 years of silence. 56 years of 55 checks, a total of 3,080 spent to protect a piece of paper. To a man like Julian, it was a senile mistake. To Elias Thorne, it was the cost of a trap that had been set before Julian's father was even in high school. The door swung wide. Julian expected gold, or silver, or perhaps a stack of worthless, moldy cash. That would have been easy. He could have reported Elias to the IRS. He could have made it a legal headache. Instead, the locker was empty. Almost. At the very back sat a single object. A heavy copper tube sealed with lead at both ends. Julian reached for it. "I wouldn't," Elias said. Julian froze. Something in Elias's voice, a cold metallic certainty, stopped him. Julian recovered quickly, his ego flaring. He grabbed the tube anyway. "It's a locker, Elias, not a holy relic." Julian twisted the lead cap. It was soft. It crumbled under his manicured fingers. Inside was a single roll of vellum paper, old, thick. The edges were charred. Julian unrolled it on a nearby table. He squinted at the faded blue ink. Blueprints. "These are the original structural schematics from 1968. He laughed, a high-pitched, jagged sound. "This is what you've been paying for? You spent $3,000 over 50 years to store a pile of trash we already have on our digital servers." Julian tossed the vellum back onto the table. He turned to his assistant. "Clear it out. Throw it in the recycling. Get the demolition crew in here by noon. I want those server racks arriving by Friday." Elias didn't flinch. He walked over to the table. He picked up the vellum. He picked up the copper tube. "The servers won't fit, Julian," Elias said quietly. "And why is that?" Julian asked, checking his Rolex. "Because this building doesn't belong to the bank anymore," Elias said. "You just broke the lease. And when you broke the lock on 402, you pulled the pin on the grenade." Julian rolled his eyes. "Security, please escort Mr. Thorne out. He's having a moment." As Elias was led toward the glass doors of the lobby, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the weight of the paper in his hand. He knew that Julian Sterling had just spent 30 seconds destroying a 30-year career. If you believe that a man's word and a silent plan are more powerful than a loud mouth and a suit, you're in the right place. We tell stories for the men who wait, for the men who remember. Subscribe to the channel. Let's get back to the vault. Elias Thorne lived 4 miles outside of Casper. His house was built of cedar and stone. No TV, no internet. Just a radio that played the weather reports and a shelf of books by Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. He sat at his kitchen table. On the table sat the vellum and the copper tube. He picked up the phone. A landline, rotary dial. "David," Elias said when the call connected. "Dad, is everything okay?" David was Elias's son, a partner at a high-end structural law firm in Cheyenne. He had his father's eyes, but his mother's restlessness. "They drilled it today, David." Julian Sterling. He didn't wait for the court order. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Elias could hear the sound of a chair wheezing. David was sitting down. "Did he touch the vellum, Dad?" "He threw it," Elias said. A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "He called it trash." David exhaled. It sounded like a man who had just won the lottery, but realized he had to walk through fire to collect it. He's a fool. He doesn't realize that Locker 402 isn't a room. It's a structural node. In 1968, the bank gave your father the rights to the footing anchors in exchange for the debt. By drilling that lock and declaring the lease void, they technically initiated a total structural default. "Explain it for a welder, David," Elias said. "It means, Dad, that the bank building is now a squatter on your property." They don't own the foundation anymore. You do, and by trying to install a server farm, which adds 400 tons of weight to those specific anchors, they are in violation of a federal safety easement. What's the move? Elias asked. Don't do anything, David said. Go to sleep. I'll be in Casper by dawn. We're not going to sue them for money, Dad. We're going to sue them for the dirt. Julian was mid-sentence, explaining to the New York board how he'd saved the bank $12,000 a year in maintenance costs by optimizing the vault. His secretary didn't knock. She just placed a bright red folder on his desk. What is this, Sarah? I'm on a call. It's a federal injunction, Mr. Sterling, from the district court in Cheyenne. And there's a man in the lobby. He says he's the sheriff. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He hung up the call without a word. He opened the folder. The language was dense, but the bold letters at the bottom were clear. Immediate cessation of all construction. Building vacation order pending structural audit. Julian felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. He grabbed his coat and ran to the elevator. In the lobby, Elias Thorne was sitting on a marble bench. He was wearing the same waxed jacket. He was reading a newspaper. Beside him stood a younger man in a charcoal suit. David. Julian marched up to them, his face flushed. What is this? This is harassment. I had every right to open that locker. David Thorne stood up. He was a head taller than Julian. Mr. Sterling, I'm David Thorne. I represent the Thorne estate. My father told you yesterday that the building wouldn't like what you were doing. You should have listened. It's a box, Julian screamed. A few tellers looked over. The sheriff stood by the door, arms crossed, watching with a bored expression. It's not a box, David said calmly. It's a 1968 anchor leasehold. When your bank acquired the previous entity in 2012, your due diligence team missed a subsurface easement. The foundation footings of this entire north wing are legally owned by my father. Your lease for those footings was tied to the sanctity of Locker 402. David stepped closer. By forcibly drilling that locker, you didn't just open a box. You terminated the bank's right to sit on this ground. As of 2 hours ago, Apex Global Finance is trespassing on Thorne land. Julian's mouth went dry. That's impossible. We own the deed. You own the air, Mr. Sterling. David smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. My father owns the steel in the ground, and he wants you to move your building. All 12 floors of it. The bank's lead counsel, a man named Henderson, cleared his throat. He had been reviewing the 1968 document for 6 hours. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. Mr. Thorne, Henderson said, addressing David, we recognize there is an irregularity in the foundation rights. It's an archaic clause. Clearly, it was never intended to be used this way. Intent is for poets, David replied. We're talking about property. My grandfather saved this bank from collapsing into the mud in '68. He was paid in steel. My father maintained that steel for 56 years. You broke the lock. You broke the deal. Henderson looked at Elias. Mr. Thorne, you're a reasonable man. What is it you want? $1 million? 2? We can settle this right now and get back to work. Elias turned his head slowly. He looked at Henderson, then he shifted his gaze to Julian. Julian was chewing his lip. His hands were shaking under the table. I don't want your millions, Elias said. The room went silent. I want the debt paid, Elias continued. In 1968, you owed my father $14,200. You didn't have it. So you gave him a piece of your heart instead. You thought he'd forget. You thought I'd forget. Elias leaned forward. The smell of old wood and iron seemed to fill the air-conditioned room. The debt, adjusted for inflation and the 8% mineral and structure interest rate, compounded annually as per the 1968 agreement, is exactly $684,200. Not a penny more. Not a penny less. Julian jumped in, his voice cracking. We'll pay it. Write the check, Henderson. Pay him and get him out of here. I'm not finished, Elias said. Julian stopped. You also destroyed a piece of history, Elias said, pointing to the vellum. That schematic was the only copy of the reinforcement grid. Without it, your server farm will cause a resonance frequency that will crack the foundation within 5 years. You want the schematic? You want the right to stay on my land? Elias looked at Julian. I want Mr. Sterling's resignation. On my desk by 5 p.m. And I want the bank to fund a scholarship for the local vocational school. For welders. For the men who actually build things. Julian looked at Henderson. He can't do that. That's personal. Henderson didn't look at Julian. He looked at the floor. Mr. Sterling, if this goes to federal court, the building will be condemned during the audit. The loss to the bank would be upwards of $80 million. The board has already been briefed. Henderson pushed a piece of paper toward Julian. It was a resignation letter. Julian Sterling, the man of the future, looked at the pen. He looked at Elias Thorne, a man of the past. Elias didn't look at him. He was looking at his black notebook. Checking the time, Julian signed. The exit was quiet. There were no cameras, no news crews, just the cold Wyoming wind blowing through the alleyway. Julian stopped at the curb. He looked at Elias. "You planned this," Julian spat. "You've been waiting for someone like me to come along, haven't you? You sat in that vault for 50 years, just waiting to ruin a man's life over a rusted box." Elias leaned against his truck. He took a slow breath of the freezing air. "I didn't wait for you, Julian," Elias said. "I didn't even know you existed. I just waited for the truth. Men like you think the world is made of numbers on a screen. You think you can delete what you don't like?" Elias pointed at the ground. "But the world is made of dirt and steel. It remembers. If you'd come to me, asked me about the box, told me your plans, I would have given you the vellum for free. I would have told you how to brace the floor for those servers." Elias opened his truck door. "But you didn't ask. You drilled. You assumed I was empty because my hands were dirty." Julian stood there as Elias drove away. The cardboard box in Julian's hands felt heavy, but the earth beneath his feet felt even heavier. For the first time in his life, Julian Sterling realized that he was the one who was empty. The check for $684,200 sat in a drawer in Elias's kitchen. He didn't spend it on a new truck. He didn't go to Vegas. He used it to fix the roofs of 6 neighbors whose barns were collapsing. He paid for the surgery of a retired miner's wife, and the rest went into the Elias Thorne Scholarship for Structural Trades. But that wasn't the victory. A month later, Elias walked back into the bank. Not Apex Global. It had been sold to a regional credit union after the structural scandal hit the financial news. The new manager was a woman in her 50s. She had calluses on her hands. She had been a project manager in construction before banking. "Mr. Thorne," she said, stepping out from behind the desk. She didn't offer a fake smile. She offered a firm handshake. "Locker 402 is ready for you. We've reinforced the door, and we've updated our records. You are the only person with a key to the foundation." Elias nodded. He walked down to the vault. It was quiet now. No drills, no arrogance, just the hum of the air and the smell of cold metal. He opened Locker 402. He placed a small photo inside. It was a picture of his father, Silas, standing on the top beam of the bank in 1968. Silas was smiling. He looked like a man who knew he'd built something that would last. Elias closed the door. He turned the key. Some men want to leave their name on the front of a building in gold letters. They want the world to see them. But the men who truly matter, the men of iron, are the ones who make sure the building doesn't fall down. They are the ones who stay in the shadows, holding the anchors. Elias Thorne walked out into the Wyoming sun. The wind was still blowing. It always was. But he didn't mind. He was anchored. The world tries to drill into what we hold dear. They think silence is weakness. They think tradition is a locker full of trash. But you and I know better. We know the value of a 1968 promise. If you're one of the few who still believes in the strength of the foundation, hit the like button. Share this with a man who needs to remember his own worth. And as always, stay quiet, stay anchored, subscribe for more stories from the vault.